and thank you for tuning in today. My name is Joann Lynch, and I'm a consultant at RSG, where I work on transportation research for public agencies. In my work, I primarily focus on travel survey projects leveraging smartphone data collection. And so during this presentation, I'm going to highlight the historic underrepresentation observed in travel surveys. I'll then discuss ways we can adapt our methods to be more inclusive and address these long-standing issues of underrepresentation. But before I get started, I'd like to take a moment to thank my co-authors, Abby Rosenson, Rachel Schmidt, and Stephen Law for their support in pulling together this presentation. We know that the benefits and burdens of transportation systems are not distributed equitably. To build a more equitable transportation system where everyone has access to safe, reliable, high quality transportation options, we need to take a look at the information and resources we use to build these systems. For example, when the data set used to build a model or develop a transportation plan underrepresents certain populations, that lack of diversity and representation can flow downstream, impacting investment decisions and priorities. The first step to building a more equitable system is improving representation in transportation data. We can have a meaningful impact by evolving our research methods and standards to provide better data so that transportation planners and modelers have high quality, representative data to support their work. Travel surveys serve as the primary information source for most government agencies' transportation planning and modeling practices. This is because they're statistically sampled to represent the full population of a region. However, certain populations are commonly underrepresented in travel survey datasets, including people with low incomes, people with disabilities, people of color, and people who are recent immigrants or new Americans. These populations often face significantly more barriers to participate in surveys, and researchers must take action to reduce these additional barriers and incentivize participation for these groups. To address underrepresentation, we must adapt our survey methods to be more inclusive. As transportation researchers, we can learn from the larger field of survey research for improvements and innovation. Different communities face different barriers to participation, and often these barriers intersect. So, for the best results, survey researchers will need to take a multi-pronged approach to address multiple barriers to participation and embed inclusion in each survey stage. Depending on your goals and constraints, the survey design team will need to work together to determine the right combination of methods that are best suited for the population you're surveying within the project's budget constraints. It's essential to consider the trade-offs in survey design early on when you're determining the scope of your survey. Overall, investments are going to need to be made and priorities must be shifted in order to prioritize inclusion. For example, decreasing your sample by 10 to 15% could allow you to significantly increase your budget for better outreach and engagement. Accepting less data while knowing your final data set is more diverse and more representative really means that the smaller data set is going to be more valuable in the end for performing equity analysis. So, how do you identify the right combination of methods for your survey? The best way to begin this process is by looking at each stage of your survey effort and determining the methods that will have the biggest impact for your survey population. I'm going to discuss a number of methods that survey researchers can consider in this process to improve representation and inclusion. To address inclusion in survey planning and preparation, there are three key areas to consider. First and foremost, offering your survey in multiple languages will ensure that respondents can participate however they're most comfortable. Similarly, asking the right question to measure bias in response is also essential. You may have representation issues that you just don't know about if you're not asking the right questions. Also, asking in questions in an inclusive way is essential to collect accurate information and to ensure that respondents feel there's an appropriate answer for them. For example, providing an inclusive list of responses for gender. And finally, you may consider providing a mixed mode survey so that respondents have options and can participate in the format they feel most comfortable. If you're conducting a large survey effort, building community partnerships early on in survey planning helps to build inclusion into your design. So, for example, you may consider conducting a focus group with hard to reach communities in order to gather feedback on their experience taking your survey during this stage. And then you can ensure that your survey design is inclusive and that the questions you're asking are asked in an appropriate way that's not going to cause respondents to drop out. Finally, in your survey sample planning, there are a number of sampling methods researchers can employ to prioritize representation. For address-based sampling, which is currently considered the gold standard in travel survey sampling, determining the level and method of oversampling you employ is a key decision at this stage. You can oversample based on geography or by leveraging third-party data. So, for instance, you can purchase additional information about addresses in your sample to forecast which addresses may be low-income households. And you can oversample based on this criteria. Essentially, at this point, you want to be compensating for the known lower response rates of historically underrepresented groups in order to send more invitations to these households to at the end of the day, have a higher share in your final sample. Recently, we've also been leveraging supplemental sampling methods in addition to address-based sampling, such as transit rider lists or recruitment through community-based organizations. We're doing this in order to better reach populations that historically have responded to mailed invitations at lower rates. So one example of this is a sampling effort that we recently did for the Metropolitan Council in the Twin Cities. We're conducting a household travel survey in this region, and in this case, we leveraged the transit agency's Transit Assistance Program, or TAP, rider list and to invite respondents in addition to our address-based sampling effort. And so the idea here was to better reach households that have responded at lower rates to mailed invitations and find a different way of inviting them to the survey to better reach these demographic groups. And this was pretty successful here. We were able to better sample low-income households as well as Black or African American residents and Hispanic or Latino residents. And so this helped us overall achieve a more representative sample for this survey by leveraging multiple sampling methods. To address inclusion in survey administration, there are again 3 key areas to consider. Public outreach for one, planning your outreach and engagement efforts that are the right fit for each community is really important. For instance, for some groups, this may be in person at a community center, whereas for others, this may be through social media. I think most importantly at this point, you just want to make sure that you're not using a one-size-fits-all approach to reach communities that have different needs and different levels of comfort with various methods of engagement. As far as participant support is concerned, ensuring that you are offering support as first and foremost is really important. And providing additional resources and support to groups who face more barriers to participate is even better. And so, for instance, providing support in multiple languages or offering technical assistance can help underrepresented groups to fully complete your survey. Finally, providing differential incentive offerings has proven really effective for better reaching certain groups that are responding at lower rates. So what do I mean by this? Offering higher incentives to groups who face more barriers to participation and who have been responding at a lower rate. So one example of that, again, in our household travel survey for the Metropolitan Council in the Twin Cities, We've leveraged a number of different differential incentive offerings in this survey effort to provide higher incentives to underrepresented groups. First, we are offering higher incentives upfront in mailed invitation materials to households in census block groups with the highest share of historically underrepresented households. And so here we're leveraging census data as well as historic survey response to just upfront offer a higher incentive to improve our recruitment rate for the survey. And then additionally, across all of the geographies within the survey region, we're offering a higher incentive at the end of the sign-up survey, given that this is a two-part survey, to demographic groups that are underrepresented based on their responses in that sign-up survey, where we collect some demographic information. And so here, we're able to increase the conversion rate, which is the number of people who sign up and then actually go on to complete for underrepresented groups by a substantial amount. And what we saw was that over in our past results, underrepresented groups had higher levels of attrition. And so by offering this at the end of sign up, we can bring that level of attrition up to what our average is. And so this is really effective in boosting representation in your survey sample. Finally, thinking about inclusion in data processing and analysis. For survey weighting, no data set is perfect, and so we always need to be addressing bias at this stage and weighting our data sets so that they truly are representative of a survey region. We certainly don't want to be using an unweighted data set to make inferences about a region when it's at least not weighted. But at the same time, we don't want to rely on weighting to correct for substantial underrepresentation. Weighting is not going to fix an issue of lower response rates from certain groups because at the end of the day, that's just going to lead to a higher likelihood of an unrepresentative sample and inaccurate analyses. You'll have extreme weights in your data set, and that will throw off the analysis that you're doing at the end. So weighting is incredibly important, but it can't be the only method that you're relying on to improve representation in your survey. And finally, survey data analysis. So here you absolutely want to be thinking about inclusion and representation to perform equity analysis. And you can use this equity analysis to highlight a couple of different things. One, where there may be biases in the data, but also, and understanding those as you work with the data set, but then also just really understanding where real inequities in travel behaviors exist. So one example of that, this is a chart from a study that we conducted for New York City Department of Transportation, and this was a travel survey. And here we have a cross tabulation of gender with a question on harassment or violence experienced while traveling. And so this chart is actually a great example of how thinking about inclusion at multiple stages enabled New York City DOT to really have some great analysis here at the end, where they initially asked gender in an inclusive way, and they were then able to do this analysis, which highlighted that respondents who identified as non-binary both saw and experienced harassment or violence when traveling at a significantly higher rate than the citywide average. And so by thinking about inclusion at multiple stages of their survey, they're able to gather some really valuable information that they can then use for planning purposes. So looking forward, the three takeaways here are really that we need to be investing in high quality representative data. And to do that, it requires us to shift priorities and sometimes accept trade-offs to address these barriers to participation and increase representation. And overall, just keeping an open mind to using new methods that rather than continuing to rely on methods that have historically been unsuccessful in getting a representative sample. So I think continuing to employ a number of methods altogether and continuing to experiment here is going to keep the practice moving forward. Thank you all, and thanks, yeah, for taking the time.